begin with today's other big story, the war on trial. Just this morning, General John Allen, the man in charge of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, said the U.S. must keep a significant combat presence there next year, despite growing public concerns about the impact of multiple redeployments. Case in point, Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales. The military is expected to file charges against him at any time now. Charges including 17 counts of murder since an other victim has now died. Local Afghans in the village where the massacre took place say those 17 civilians were killed in retaliation for an IED attack. The Pentagon denies any evidence of either the IED or any kind of retaliation motive. In the wake of those killings, we're hearing a lot of discussion now about traumatic brain injuries, the so-called signature wounds of the Iraq and Afghan wars. Sergeant Bales suffered TBI while in Iraq, but was shipped out anyway for a fourth tour of duty this winter, destination Afghanistan. The Department of Defense estimates as many as 80% of our troops with blast injuries might also suffer TBI. 80%. TBI is also commonly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, impacting 20% of all returning Iraq and Afghan veterans. Those numbers only go up with repeat deployments, which leads us to ask again, what are we doing to our troops? We start with Dr. Harry Croft, a trauma psychiatrist and former Army doctor who's evaluated more than 7,000 veterans with PTSD. He's also author of I Always Sit with My Back to the Wall, which offers help to PTSD patients. And Afghan war veteran and military medic Nick Colgin, membership coordinator at the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. He also suffered a traumatic brain injury on the battlefield himself. Welcome, gentlemen. Nick, let me start with you. You suffered what's called TBI. What does that involve exactly? How did you experience yours, and what are soldiers go through in this situation?
I was a medic with the 82nd Airborne based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I deployed to Afghanistan for roughly 15 months. And on the deployment, I did a lot of good. Most notably, I helped save a French soldier who had been shot in the head, and my unit was responsible for the rescuing of 42 Afghans from a flooding river. But at the same time, a rocket-propelled grenade hit off my Humvee and forever changed my life. I came back with a traumatic brain injury, among many other transition issues.
Were you knocked out? Explain to people what that means.
I just remember I saw it was like white for a second, and the next day I woke up and I didn't feel the same inside. I had an eye twitch, and I just didn't feel similar, and a lot of my battle buddies picked up on it.
How long ago was that now?
That was 2008, and it's 2012 now, and I'm still fighting through it every day.
Let me bring you in, Harry. Dr. Croft, talk a little bit about the difference between TBI and post-traumatic stress disorder. They're not one and the same, and we don't know yet exactly what Sergeant Bales may or may not have suffered, but take us through the differences and how you think about that.
So post-traumatic stress disorder and the symptoms of TBI can overlap, but as you said, Matt, they are separate disorders. PTSD involves symptoms of re-experiencing in the form of thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance in the terms of not wanting to socialize, being apart, being distant and detached, having their moods kind of shrunken down so they don't feel the full range of emotions. And then the third cluster of symptoms is called arousal, and that involves trouble with sleep even without nightmares, being hypervigilant and suspicious, being angry and irritable, and so those are the PTSD symptoms. The symptoms of traumatic brain injury can involve dizziness, headaches, changes in behavior that may be similar to PTSD, but also, as Nick said, maybe even neurologic symptoms, which may include weakness or numbness or other types of symptoms.
Now, Doctor, you obviously haven't examined Sergeant Bales, but you have examined over 7,000 during the course of your career, soldiers who suffered from PTSD. It was also interesting that on the campaign trail today, Bob Kerrey, a former veteran, obviously, and Medal of Honor winner, who's campaigning for Senate in Nebraska, offered one comment to a reporter that he thought that Sergeant Bales seemed to be suffering from some kind of mental illness. We shouldn't base our entire Afghan policy in an overreaction to one man's troubles. What's your gut tell you? Do you have any gut instinct about what we may be dealing with in terms of the Sergeant Bales case?
My gut tells me that it's probably more than simply PTSD or TBI or a combination of the two. We don't know, Matt, the impact of multiple deployments into an area that's not only dangerous, but it's difficult to deal with the folks there. We don't know the impact of being told you're not going back because you have disabling conditions, and then switched and said, oops, you are going back. We don't know the impact of all that, plus seeing a friend get their leg blown off, and you add to that stressors at home and stressors we probably don't yet understand. You add all that together, and we don't know what happens to people like Sergeant Bales, but I assume this is more than simply PTSD and TBI.
Now, Nick, you're involved, obviously, in representing the interests of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. This must be the talk of that community today. What do you and your colleagues make of the Sergeant Bales situation and what it means?
Yes, we have an online community called Community of Veterans on IAVA.org, and on there, veterans are trying to make sure that this incident doesn't define them. Like, there's words out there. He had PTSD, he had TBI, it could have been alcohol. We don't know what it was, but the important thing to remember is I'm sitting right in front of you right now and I have a TBI, and I've never done anything like that, and neither of the 2.4 million veterans that have served overseas.
Right, millions of people who've been in very difficult circumstances, and so we obviously don't know the bottom of this yet, but it's an isolated circumstance that's not representative at all. And yet, Doctor, let me bring you back in. What does it say about the larger question of what we're doing in Afghanistan, when we've got folks going over multiple times, when we've got this kind of toll being taken, at least on, even if it's an exception, on troops across the board? How should we make sense of this? Isn't it time to get out?
That's a political decision. That's a military decision. I think I'll leave that to those folks involved making those decisions. But in terms of the impact of multiple deployments, we don't know the impact yet. This is, as I understand it from the vets I've seen, the first war in the history of modern American warfare where soldiers are sent back to the same combat area again and again and again, and even when they're home, Matt, mentally they may not be. It's called dwell time, but they may be getting ready for the next deployment. We don't know the impact of all that. When I lecture around the country, my concern is exactly what Nick said. I don't want the stigma of any soldier, any warrior who's been in Iraq or Afghanistan to be besmirched by what happened in this one isolated incident. And when I talk to businesses, I don't want them to get the idea that every soldier who comes back from Iraq and Afghanistan will behave in this heinous way. This is a very unusual circumstance.
Nick, when I've been talking to a buddy in the Navy in the recent days since this all broke, and he says the Navy guys say this really raises a question of what have we done to the U.S. Army, because they're the ones bearing the brunt of all this. How would you respond to that?
Honestly, it's shaken the perception of the war in many Americans, and also it's challenged the professional, humble warriors that are overseas serving every day. But it's important to remember that our soldiers need the resources and support from the second they deploy to the minute they come home and throughout their life, whether there are 1, 2, 3 deployments. And it's great we're having this conversation about how many deployments are too much. The time to have the conversation is now, because right now, what's worse, a 6-month deployment, a 15-month deployment? We don't know. So it's important to look at these factors and get to the bottom of it and get our troops the resources they need.
And Dr. Croft, are we doing enough when it comes to the veterans who have come back home? I spent some time on the VA website today. A lot of materials there on PTSD, on traumatic brain injury, on ways for families and loved ones to try and help their service member cope. Those are good words, but do we really do right by our veterans at this point?
Well, I think the VA is trying to do right by the veterans, but many veterans don't trust the VA. They have negative feelings. That's one of the reasons we wrote the book and developed the website, so that people could come externally to the VA and still get the good information they need that can help them through this difficult time.
All right, Dr. Harry Croft, Nick Colgin, thank you for taking us through these very important issues that have come to the front of the news in a very tragic circumstance. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.